Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you a famous classic game played by the first official world chess champion Wilhelm Steinitz. The topic of this lesson is how to make plans and to attack. This game started with white playing e4 and black responding with the center counter, or as it's also called, the Scandinavian defense. White captured and black captured back. Generally, we do not recommend the queen to come out this early in the game. However, it is an exception in this opening. Nevertheless, because the queen comes out so early in the game, it's not considered as one of the mainstream or best openings from black's perspective. The reason for that is that the white knight, by developing to c3, immediately attacks the black queen, which now needs to move again, and that is waste of time. Here, black has several reasonable options, moving the queen to a5 or moving it to d6, which became popular in the past decade or so. But the old move used to be to simply retreat the queen to d8, and that's exactly what happened in this game as well. White continued by occupying the center with the pawn and opening the diagonal for white's dark-squared bishop. Black played e6, which is a bit passive, locking in his own light-squared bishop. Probably knight f6 would be a bit more recommendable. Knight f3, knight f6, both sides are developing, bishop to d3, and bishop e7. Nothing major happened so far. Castle, castle, and bishop e3. Well, the bishop certainly could have gone to f4 or g5 as well, but we cannot say anything really bad about this move either. If we evaluate the position so far, we can see that white has nicely developed all the minor pieces. All of them are controlling center squares, and also the white king has already castled. White has a pretty good control of the center, having one pawn right there on d4. While black has been developing also, however, wasted some time by moving with the queen back and forth. And we can see that black's queen side is still undeveloped. And that's exactly what black was trying to solve with his next move by playing b6. And here comes the first critical moment. After developing all our pieces and castling, what to do next? Well, one natural thing to do would be to simply move the queen to e2 or d2 and to connect the rooks, and then to centralize both rooks. However, in situations like this, oftentimes there are opportunities to immediately create a bit more aggressive plan, especially if our opponent was generous enough with wasting moves. In this case, white continued with knight e5, which is a very good idea to centralize the knight. It's not easy to attack that knight with a pawn, so therefore it's in a stable place, unlike if black would have a pawn, let's say on d7, and could chase it with d6. Now the knight is very well positioned because it controls important squares that black would like to use for his pieces. Naturally, black continued with bishop b7. Typically, when one plays b6, the follow-up should be bishop to b7 next. And here comes white's interesting idea by playing f4 immediately, trying to open the position. That's one of the most typical plans one would have after everything has been developed. And especially if you have a lead in development, you would be looking for ways to open the position more, so the better development and the more active position would play a more important role. Black continued with knight bd7. So at this stage, Black has developed all his minor pieces as well. However, White still has a small plus here, namely by having space advantage, and we'll see immediately why that is important. White moved his queen to e2, and we can see that White has pieces from the first through the fifth rank, while all of the black pieces are limited to the last 3 rows of the chessboard. This is one of the ways we define having space advantage. Now, the reason why this is important, because unlike what White just did, moving the queen to e2 and connecting the rooks on the first rank, Black cannot easily do the same because of lack of space. Black would also like to move his queen out of his rook's way, but he cannot, because for now his pieces are limited on the last 3 rows. A general advice when one has a cramped position to try to exchange some pieces, so therefore that smaller space that you have can be used by less pieces and therefore will not be felt so cramped. However, in this case, Black's specific attempt wasn't the greatest idea. Black moved the knight to d5. I would have rather tried to play c5 and to make sure the queen can get out there to connect the rooks. After knight d5, White continued immediately by trading knights, with the idea that if the bishop captures back, White could play c4. Black played probably an inferior move by capturing back with the pawn and locking up that bishop on b7. And now again it's time to make a plan, what to do next. Well, it's time to attack, and this is when it's important to be familiar with different tactical patterns. Remember this one, it's a good one. White played rook to f3. Well, what is happening now? White created an immediate threat, which is being demonstrated well if we check out what would happen if Black would respond with c5. Now, White would be ready for an immediate sacrifice, and if king takes bishop, rook h3, check. King g8 and queen h5. And the checkmate threat is very, very unpleasant. Black couldn't have escaped by blocking the check either, because White would check anyway, followed by rook captures bishop, and again Black is helpless against the threat of checkmate on h7 or h8. Let's go back. So White has just played the rook to f3, threatening bishop captures on h7. Black responded by playing f5, preventing that move. But let's check out for a moment what would happen if Black would trade knights. Well, in that case, White would be safe to capture back either way. Capturing with the f-pawn has its own advantages, because it makes sure that the black bishop doesn't get revived, and also then the white rook doubling up on the f-file looks really attractive for White. At the same time, capturing back with the other pawn is not a bad idea either, because Black cannot afford to play d4 here, either for the same tactical reason as we've seen before, bishop check, followed by rook check, and queen h5, and even though in this case Black can try to make a little opening for the king to escape from the checks, but White has a neat move by playing e6, taking away that escape square. Let's go back and see how the game itself continued. Black played f5. While this move certainly stopped all of those bishop h7 ideas, it made the knight on e5 being even more powerful. In future times now, if the black knight would capture on e5, that would mean that when white recaptures with either pawn, that would be a protected passed pawn. White continued with the attack and played rook h3. The idea is to play queen h5, if black allows it. For example, after c5, white would be ready to indeed play queen h5, which in all reality is a double attack, because not only it attacks the pawn on h7, but also the pawn on f5, and for example after h6, white would be ready to capture it. Let's go back. After rook h3, black really strategically would like to play knight f6 right now, on one hand to prevent queen h5, but perhaps even more importantly, to try to position his knight equally active as white's knight is on e4. There is a tactical problem, however, that this is too slow. If black would play knight f6, all of a sudden the rook from f8 no longer protects the pawn on f5, and that would be a loss of pawn. Let's go back to the game and see how that continued. Black played g6 right now, which prevents queen h5, but obviously weakens the position in front of black's king. And this was an interesting moment where white could have and perhaps should have played a bit more conservatively by playing, let's say, bishop to f2. With various tactical ideas, getting one piece out of the e-file, so after a possible knight jump, the queen can immediately cause trouble for black. And white would be ready to bring the queen rook to the e-file and create threats. Instead, white played super aggressively and played immediately g4. It's certainly a logical and understandable move, despite the fact that generally I do not recommend to open up the position in front of your king. But this is an exception because the white pieces are so well positioned. However, yet, due to a tactical issue, it is inferior to the recommended bishop f2. After g4, black should have traded the knights on e5, because then after pawn takes back and pawn takes on g4, then after queen g4, bishop c8 results some complications. Of course, white had the choice also not to capture back immediately, but to play rook g3. Black missed this opportunity and got into serious trouble from here on. Black captured the pawn on g4 immediately. Now white has an overwhelming attack in more than one way. Steinitz played the fancy way by sacrificing his rook. However, the solid queen captures g4 may have been just as good, if not even better. Now, if black would play knight f6, white could simply retreat the queen, maintaining devastating threats. For example, if bishop c8, a beautiful rook sacrifice on h7, followed by queen g6, king h8, and then simply a quiet move, king h1, clearing the space for white's rook on g1 to enter the attack. And then next, white would bring the rook or check first and then bring the rook, depending how black continues. Let's move back and see some other possibilities that could have happened. After pawn took on g4, queen g4 was, as I said, perhaps an even better choice, Another variation to illustrate that is, after knight would capture on e5 right now, white would still maintain a very dangerous attack after pawn captures back. Let's go to see the game, however, that was very interesting in itself. White captured the pawn on h7, sacrificing the rook. If now the black king recaptures, then the idea is to simply play queen g4 and threaten with queen g6, as well, of course, as capturing the knight on d7. And now, if knight f6, we reach a very similar idea as we saw before. Queen takes pawn, and then the quiet move, king h1 clears the g1 square for the rook, and black is helpless against white's attack. Let's go back after rook h7 and see how the game continued. Black captured knight e5, a good-looking intermediate move. White recaptured, still sacrificing the rook, which black captured this time. And now queen captures g4. And this is ultimately the critical moment of the game where black went wrong. Let me show you how the game continued. Black moved rook to g8, protecting the pawn on g6, and this pretty much loses the game. A better choice was to play queen e8 instead. Although even then white has a very strong attack, but wouldn't win this quickly as he did in the game. Then white would continue with queen h5 check, for example king g7, and queen h6. Of course, in situations when you sacrifice a rook for an attack, you typically need to follow up with forceful and energetic moves. King g8, and then bishop captures g6. Now the black queen is hanging, as well as white threatens to checkmate. Black must put the rook into a pin, and then again a move we're already familiar with, king h1. And white's attack at the end of the day will prevail again. Let's go back just a bit and see this position again. So black captured the rook, came queen g4, and black made a mistake by protecting the pawn with the rook instead of the queen. Now things worked beautifully for white. Check came, king g7. A last trick for black. If white would play the greedy queen takes pawn, of course things would turn all around by black moving out of the check, all of a sudden pinning the white queen. So white gave instead the correct check on h6, forcing the king to f7, and another check with the queen. If the rook blocks right now, then white can use the pin and play bishop g6 check, followed by check on h8 and checkmate with the bishop. Let's go back. After queen h7, the game continued with the king moving to e6. And now another check, no time to waste, king f7. And here white had an even better choice than what he played by pushing the pawn up, followed by simply playing queen h7, attacking the rook and threatening checkmate all at once. Instead, white gave the rook check in this position by rook f1, although this wins quite simply as well. If king g7, white checkmates in one move, so the king was trying to run towards the other side, but white plays very energetically with queen e6, going right after black's rook. And the problem is, if the rook moves away to the h file or f file, then white checkmates right away in one move. Therefore, black kept the rook on the g file. And here again, there is more than one good way. In addition to the game move, bishop h6 worked pretty well as well, because now the rook has no place to go without getting checkmated. White instead moved the bishop to g5, which does the job as well, as we shall see. A cute line: in case the bishop would chase the queen, white would check, fork the other rook, and if bishop d7 protecting the rook, then checkmate in 2, either bishop or queen takes. Very nice. Let's go back again. After bishop g5, black played queen to d7, hoping to trade queens, but of course no such luck. Bishop g6. If king d8, the problem is the white rook is able to come down to f8 using the pin on the h4 d8 diagonal. So black rather captured on g6, queen captured back, king d8, and still the same problem, rook f8, and black gets checkmated after queen e8, queen e8. A very nice attacking game, even though the rook sacrifice was not necessary. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this fascinating position, black has a very far advanced and dangerous passed pawn on c2. What should white do about it? Can white catch it? It doesn't seem so, because it seems that pretty much after any white move, black will capture the pawn on e3 with a check and then promote the pawn. But white came out with an ingenious plan. I suggest you give yourself some time and try to figure out the answer yourself before you listen to the correct solution. And the only correct solution is to go bishop g6, threatening to capture the knight with a check and then the pawn. But as we said, black will play bishop e3 with a check. Now if rook takes bishop, the pawn promotes, pinning the rook, and black would win. The amazing move is to play king h5. But how does this stop from the pawn promoting? Well, it doesn't, but it creates an amazing saving situation. White plays rook b1, giving up the rook. Of course, if queen does not take the rook, it's a theoretical drawn endgame. But if it does, then white captures the knight with a check. And when queen captures back, all of a sudden, it's stalemate. A truly brilliant composition by Procas. Thank you so much for listening, and so long until next week.